For VOR News in Washington, I'm Kate Zickel. Over the last year or two, we've seen a couple of examples of what some people might refer to as martial law in the United States. One example is the Boston bombing this year, in which riot police approached the city and told people to institute a curfew and not leave their homes. I'm speaking now with Dave Hodges, who is the host of The Common Sense Show. Dave, thanks for joining me this morning.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
Now, let's talk a little bit about what constitutes martial law. Like I said, we saw a small instance of this with the Boston bombing. Some people would argue it's not so small. We had riot police in the street. People were told to stay in their homes. But what do you think constitutes martial law? When we say that, what do we think of?
Well, technical definition of martial law is basically the suspension of civilian authority and the imposition of military authority. And you're right, Kate, that's exactly what we did see following the Boston Marathon bombings. We had people actually taken out of their homes in their night clothing at gunpoint, and that's all been videotaped. I believe that Boston was a dry run for martial law procedures.
So you think martial law is coming to the United States a lot faster than most people would argue?
Well,
or even that it's coming at all. Some people don't necessarily think that.
It's already here. We're in stage one of 3 stages of martial law. And stage one consists of basically passing the legislation that will allow the imposition of martial law, the passing of the National Defense Authorization Act, which allows the president and his subordinates to arrest people without due process. It's basically secretly arrest them, take them off the streets, no lawyers, no one knows where they're at. And then Executive Order 13603, which came in the same year, in 2011, which basically allows the president complete authority over all resources in the United States, including human capital. People can be drafted into civilian conscription labor camps. They can also be drafted into the military simply based on the say-so of the president, and the Department of Labor, under this executive order, would oversee both procedures. So the lines have been drawn, and you also see in stage 2, which we've entered into, the creation of an enemies list. And I believe this is the result, and this is what my inside sources tell me from the NSA, this is the result of the massive spy surveillance grid that we see with the NSA spying, where people have been assigned a fluid threat matrix score. And we see a lot of evidence of the fact that in stage 2 you have restrictions of travel. Well, this is what the TSA is doing. We're now seeing TSA-type procedures at places like NFL football games. And interestingly enough and scary, there has been an agreement between DHS, FEMA, Simon Properties, the NFL, and other major league sports franchises to convert their facilities into detention camps in times of national emergency.
I hate to cut you off, but I really got to ask, do you have an example of that where an NFL stadium is agreeing to turn into a camp?
Yeah, it's a formal agreement. I've written about it on my website, and I've documented the link back to the DHS agreement. Simon Properties is the biggest owner of malls and strip malls in North America, and they signed a bilateral agreement with DHS back in 2012, which would allow for such a thing to happen.
Yeah, but which stadium?
No, this isn't stadiums. These would be malls for the Simon Properties Group.
Okay,
and
which
on
mall?
The heels of that agreement, the NFL was the first organization to say, yeah, we can convert our facilities in times of a national emergency for rescue camps or detention camps, whatever the need may be. And I've written about that. That's in articles I've written in September of 2012, in which I documented both agreements. I don't have any problem with the United States government forming such agreements with private entities in times of national emergencies. But when you combine that with this draconian legislation, the NDAA and the executive order I just referenced, that speaks to unwarranted detention of masses of American citizens.
You mentioned malls. Now, I know this is kind of a general agreement with, like you said, with this properties company, but are there specific malls that are on this list?
No, it's a general agreement.
Okay.
Between the owners of the mall and the Department of Homeland Security. And, and Kate, we don't have to go any further than just what DHS has been doing in terms of weaponizing over the past 12 months. They have acquired 2.2 billion rounds of ammunition, 2,700 armored personnel carriers. Now, this is a domestic police force. Why would they need to arm to this level? They're not going to be sent overseas to fight against some terrorist organization. You can only conclude reasonably that this weaponizing of DHS is to subdue the American public. And I believe that we're on the precipice of having a cataclysmic event which is going to lead to martial law, and that event is financial. The $17 trillion debt that we're focused on is a smokescreen. We have an unfunded liabilities debt of $238 trillion, which includes Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. And then the bankers have managed to get the governments of the modern world to assume the derivatives debt, which is $1 quadrillion on the low estimate side. That's 16 times the GDP of the planet. We can't sustain that debt. We can't pay that debt. That will eventually lead to a financial collapse, and I believe that will be the trigger event for the rollout of martial law that the government is presently preparing for.
Dave, you mentioned, we'll get back to that in a second, because I do want to talk about examples of other countries that may or may not have seen this. But you mentioned an enemies list. As far as you know, does that list exist, and who's on it?
Well, what I've been told, and one of my sources is now deceased, but he was a former member of the NSA and began to speak out before his death, and he appeared on many radio programs, along with some other sources I have, say that part of the reason that we have this massive NSA spying grid that Ed Snowden is currently revealing and seems like segmented press releases is to basically create an enemies list. And the proof of that, you don't even have to get inside the NSA to see it. We see it outwardly. The DHS created something called the MEAC report, and in it listed domestic terrorist groups, people that support the Second Amendment, former Ron Paul supporters, libertarians, constitutionalists. And now the latest trend is they have stuck what they call, quote, Bible-believing Christians. At a briefing in April earlier this year in La Junta, Colorado, DHS gave a law enforcement briefing in which they said Bible-believing Christians are a new domestic terror threat in the United States. So that's what I say is the manifestation of the NSA spying, is the creation of these threat groups. And I believe that when we go into martial law, these people will be secondary citizens, be subject to full stripping of their civil liberties, if not mass detentions.
Dave, have we seen examples of, like you mentioned, you mentioned a trigger event or a cataclysmic event that is necessary to shove the country into full martial law? Have we seen this in other countries in the complete sense that you're talking about?
Kate, I think the best example from history comes from the contrived Reichstag fire perpetrated by the Nazis, which they laid the blame on the communists, and it was done part and parcel to assume complete control of the German government.
Let's talk about the TSA. We've only got a couple minutes. You mentioned the TSA as an example. I believe you said it's like step 2 or stage 2. Now, everybody hates going to the airport. Everybody hates taking off their shoes and having to go through the metal detectors and, raise your hands above your arm or above your head. But that seems to me more like an inconvenience than it would be, say, an example of the government completely taking over and moving into a military power.
Well, if you go on the paradigm of restriction of travel, which always accompanies martial law, the TSA is really the first salvo in that process. So on that sense, you are right. It could be considered to be an inconvenience, except the inconvenience is spreading through all aspects of our lives. 2 years ago at a prom in Santa Fe, at a high school, Santa Fe, New Mexico, the TSA was invited in to conduct security. We're seeing it on the highways now in what's called the Viper program. And now, speaking of the NFL has introduced TSA-type practices before you can enter an NFL football game. Women can't even take their purses into an NFL event. And then in April of 2012, DHS made a massive purchase of hardened concrete bunker facilities that is to be placed at key locations on highways. And I have the DHS archive ordering of that material on my website, and the date for that is October 13th. I published it in an article called The 3 Stages of Martial Law. So this has spread a lot farther than just the TSA groping our grannies.
Dave, we're out of time, but I did want to ask you, if people want to find out more or reference some of your material or even just take a look at what you've written, where can they go?
They can go to thecommonsenseshow.com. It's all 400 articles.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for your time. I wish we could go longer. We'd love to have you on again.
Okay, thank you for having me.